Good morning. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the 24th meeting of the 53rd session of the Human Rights Council is now open. Excellencies, colleagues, we will resume the interactive dialogue on the report of the Secretary General on the adverse impact of climate change on the full realization of the right to food. Continuing with our list of speakers, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Romania aligns itself with your statement. We welcome the UN Secretary-General Comprehensive Report and its recommendations to further the food system's resilience. Climate change and environmental degradation are intrinsically connected, exacerbating each other and increasing the risk of simultaneous harvest failures in major producing countries. They are already affecting food production security, access and affordability, and thus the full realization of the right to food. At the same time, unsustainable food production also drives environmental degradation and water scarcity. Effective climate actions and sustainable consumption and production patterns must be developed and implemented urgently. The multilateral system, together with all relevant stakeholders, especially the business sector, should decide and engage in coordinated measures in this respect. A rights-based approach to food systems transformation is imperative, as the first target of any climate action and nutritious food accessibility measure should be the rights holders. Women are the first victims of food scarcity, but children and older persons are also severely affected. The report mentions the armed conflict in Ukraine among the factors triggering the increase in the global food prices. We condemn the recent destruction of the Novakakhovka Dam and express concern over its massive damage scale, ecological disaster, crops affected by floods, irrigation system destroyed, and in the long run, possible rise in food prices. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor, and good morning to all. At the outset, thanks to the UNSG for his report 5347 on climate change and the right to food. My delegation takes note of the recommendations contained therein. Climate change is a major threat to right to food. This right can be affected in many ways, including by decreasing crop yields, making food production more expensive, and disrupting food distribution. The adverse impact of climate change on the right to food is disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable, particularly in Africa. It is therefore imperative to redouble our collective action under the UNFCCC to address climate change based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in order to protect the right to food for all and to leave no one behind, especially those people living under colonial or foreign occupation whose rights are often completely denied. Accordingly, we request the UNSG to take into account the views of these voiceless peoples in its upcoming reports and studies pertaining to human rights and climate change. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Botswana.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Secretary General for her comprehensive report. Indeed, climate change poses a serious threat to humanity and is increasingly becoming an obstacle to the full and effective realization of the right to food. The intensification of droughts and floods continue to result in decreased crop yields, which is detrimental to the livelihoods of rural populations dependent on agricultural production. We therefore wish to underline that the urgent action is needed in addressing loss and damage in the context of climate change to respond to the concerns of all affected countries. In that regard, increased international cooperation and assistance in the form of financial, technological, and capacity support to the developing countries in their mitigation and adaptation efforts is of utmost importance. For her part, Botswana ratified the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which is a blueprint for concerted actions by countries to combat climate change and indeed to adapt to its effect. The enhancement of international cooperation and support mitigation of climate change effects remains the viable option that can sustain livelihoods in order to advance the full enjoyment of human rights by all. Climate change mitigation measures undertaken by Botswana include the provision of drought-resistant seeds to farmers and the use of multiple hazard early warning systems to enable early detection of as well as advanced preparation of natural disasters. Botswana continues to implement such measures to combat climate change and its adverse impact in line with Sustainable Development Goal. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Gracias, vicepresidente. El cambio climático y la contaminación son hoy dos de los problemas más preocupantes que afectan la vida y los derechos humanos de las generaciones presentes y futuras. Mientras algunos países desarrollados hacen todo lo posible para evitar sus compromisos de solución a la crisis climática, los países en desarrollo están haciendo mayores esfuerzos de reducción de emisiones y pagando el precio de una crisis climática que todos los días deja sequías, inundaciones, huracanes, tifones, etc. La crisis climática nos priva de alimentos, destruye nuestra economía y genera inseguridad. Bolivia enfatiza la importancia de la contribución de los sistemas alimentarios al desarrollo integral de los países y de los pueblos para vivir bien. Para el país es esencial la producción agrícola local, campesina y de comunidades interculturales, entre otras. Estas componen lo que conocemos como el sistema de producción alimentario basado en la agricultura tradicional, por lo que coincidimos con lo mencionado en el párrafo 16 del informe del secretario general. Asimismo, acogemos con agrado que el informe haga referencia a la importancia de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los campesinos y de otras personas que trabajan en las zonas rurales. Este instrumento, promovido por Bolivia junto a varios países y sociedad civil, reconoce el derecho a una alimentación saludable y culturalmente apropiada, producida mediante métodos ecológicamente razonables y sostenibles. En este sentido, creemos urgente avanzar en la implementación de este instrumento, ya que las y los campesinos y otras personas que trabajan en las zonas rurales proveen la mayor parte de los alimentos para la atención de las necesidades del mundo y, como señalado en las recomendaciones del informe, son contradictoriamente las personas más expuestas a sufrir inseguridad alimentaria y hambre. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. Vice President, Cyprus would like to express its appreciation to the United Nations Secretary-General for reporting on this highly critical issue. We need to collectively work towards creating the conditions where the right to food can be fully realised. As the report demonstrates, food security that was already deteriorating due to several factors, including economic shocks linked to the COVID-19 pandemic and high food prices, is compounded by the adverse impact of climate change. Furthermore, together with other factors, as also noted in this report, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has contributed towards food inflation. The IPCC has showcased that by formulating effective adaptation and mitigation strategies to climate change, it is possible to reduce or even avoid some of the negative impacts of climate change on food systems. Many, if not all of these strategies the IPCC recommends, and as pronounced in the Secretary-General's report, are in fact ones that are based on respecting, protecting and fulfilling human rights. How can states best ensure that climate mitigation and adaptation efforts do not adversely affect human rights and, in fact, are based on a human rights approach? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation thanks the Secretary-General for his report. Nepal is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change due to its fragile geography.
evidenciadas. Deseamos consultar qué ejemplo de buenas prácticas nos puede compartir para garantizar la responsabilidad de las empresas como componente clave de esta transición. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Vice President, Bangladesh takes note of the Secretary General's report on the adverse impact of climate change on the full realization of the right to food. The government of Bangladesh has adopted a comprehensive whole-of-society approach to ensuring food security. Our Constitution recognizes access to food and adequate nutrition as a fundamental human right. We have adopted several policies in line with the SDGs of ending hunger and achieving food security by 2030. Despite remarkable achievement in agricultural productivity, our food security is facing challenges from climate change. Sea level rise and coastal erosion would put 17% loss of land surface and 30% loss of food production by 2050 in our country. To tackle the challenges, the government has already undertaken initiatives to mainstream climate change adaptation into National Development Plan as a key plan. As a global leader in adaptation, we are working on climate resilient agriculture and food systems. We have been funding research on crop types that are capable of withstanding both salinity and drought. Mr. Vice President, with a view to transitioning to sustainable food systems, the developed countries and international organizations, particularly the IFIs, must come forward to support the developing countries, in particular the net food importing ones, with finance, technology and capacity building programs aiming at simultaneously addressing the climate crisis and safeguarding the right to food. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Uganda via Zoom. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We note with appreciation the Secretary General's report, which casts a much-needed spotlight on the deepening impact of climate change on food security. Given the current global context, food security has become a priority for Trinidad and Tobago, with efforts being made to reduce our high food import bill, incentivize the agroeconomy, and build resilience to climate change. Notably, as a small island developing state, these efforts are often stymied by 1. Our increasing vulnerability to adverse weather events and slow onset issues such as sea level rise, 2. Global conflicts and the resulting volatility of international commodity prices, and 3, the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, we have recognized the need for enhanced international cooperation in order to strengthen national resilience to these global shocks. One such example is a project being done in collaboration with the FAO on improving the monitoring system for climate change impacts on the agriculture sector in Trinidad and Tobago. In closing, Trinidad and Tobago echoes calls for increased climate financing, particularly for adaptation and loss and damage, as well as continued technical cooperation and capacity building as we align the transformation of our food systems with national climate action. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Agradecemos a la Oficina del Secretario General la presentación de su informe. México hace un llamado enérgico a todos los países a efecto de reconocer el derecho a un medio ambiente limpio, sano y sostenible. Consideramos trascendental que exista congruencia entre lo que los Estados promovemos en este Consejo de Derechos Humanos y aquello que fomentamos en otros foros de Naciones Unidas, como la COP de la Convención Marco sobre Cambio Climático. México continuará defendiendo los más altos estándares en los foros de cambio climático, incluyendo un enfoque basado en derechos humanos para la acción climática. Asimismo, seguiremos abogando por la participación, la seguridad y la protección de las personas defensoras de derechos humanos y de las personas negociadoras en estos foros, especialmente de mujeres jóvenes, entre actos de hostigamiento y acoso, incluyendo acoso sexual. Nos pronunciamos en contra de cualquier forma de violencia, incluida aquella motivada por razones de género. Señor Secretario General, ¿cuáles serían sus recomendaciones para garantizar la incorporación de una perspectiva de derechos humanos en las negociaciones de cambio climático y para garantizar un espacio libre de violencia para todos aquellos que promueven la integración de esta perspectiva? Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Nations Environmental Programme.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Nations Environment Programme appreciates the report of the Secretary General on the adverse impact of climate change on the realization of the right to food. The right to food is one of the rights that is adversely affected by climate change and other environmental harm. The realization of the right to food and the realization of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment are inherently interconnected. The recognition of the right to a healthy environment by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly has prompted greater intergovernmental recognition of the importance and criticality of a healthy environment. In 2022, nations explicitly highlighted this right at the Climate and Biodiversity Conferences. Looking ahead, numerous opportunities exist to integrate the right to a healthy environment into other intergovernmental processes. These include the forthcoming climate conference, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, and the 6th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. UNEP is fully committed to supporting states and other stakeholders in integrating and in implementing the right to a healthy environment for all. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zambia.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Secretary General for his report on the adverse impact of climate change on the full realization of the right to food. Climate change, which has increased frequency and intensity of extreme events as drought and floods, is a great threat to food security. Zambia, like many other countries, has been experiencing adverse impacts of climate change, including an increase in frequency and severity of seasonal droughts, occasional dry spells, increased temperatures in valleys, flash floods, and changes in the growing season. These conditions have led to a reduction in food production. In order to mitigate these effects, Zambia has launched a climate change policy promoting climate-smart practices, such as promotion of efficient use of water resources, strengthening early warning systems and preparedness, and using remote sensing in mapping of drought and flood-prone areas. We conclude by emphasizing the need for sustainable solutions and collective effort to tackle the effects of climate change. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation signed the Secretary General for presentation of the report. We share the view that climate change threatens the full and effective realization of the right to food. Cambodia has implemented mechanisms to protect and manage forest-rich protected area and biodiversity to address climate change. Despite being a low emitter of greenhouse gas, Cambodia has consistently contributed to climate mitigation. As the first country in ASEAN and second in LDC, Cambodia submitted a long-term strategy for carbon neutrality with the 2050 target to the UNFCCC and updates its NDC report with a 42% emission reduction goal by 2030. To address food crisis, Cambodia has identified 4 priorities for its 2030 food system vision: healthy diet for all, women and vulnerable empowerment,